Well, Shabana, I keep hearing that Pillar 2 may be very impactful in the Middle East. Give me your thoughts on why that might be.
Hi, Rodney. And yes, you're right. I think it will be of a high impact nature in this part of the world. And the reason for that is because of the current systems we have in place. So in countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, we have a hybrid tax system of zakat and corporate tax. And then other jurisdictions such as the UAE, where I'm based right now, and in Bahrain, there isn't a corporate tax or a mainstream corporate tax. So as a result, this idea of a global minimum tax of at least 15% as part of Pillar 2 may see a significant shift away from, having low effective tax rates in this part of the world to obviously a much higher minimum rate of 15%.
Interesting, almost causing like a sea change in the way people think about taxes as a policy matter in the region. So I know that the UAE serves as a hub for many companies and sectors. What do you think those companies should be thinking about today?
Yeah, and you're right, it is a hub. I mean, you can just look at the airport in Dubai and it's an aviation hub, and that's been replicated in the corporate world as well. So, we've had a number of companies and corporates using the Dubai and Abu Dhabi as their main location for, accessing markets in other parts of Asia, Africa, and of course the wider Middle East region. So there are a number of groups here in that very predicament. Right? So they are, they've enjoyed historically a lot of tax kind of opportunities and savings around, very minimal tax rates here in the UAE, where there are any. So I think those groups in particular may find, especially where they're headquartered in a parent jurisdiction that does introduce Pillar 2, they will suddenly find that their effective tax rate in this part of the world needs to be topped up. And whether that's via the income inclusion rule or one of the other measures, but essentially they will need to start thinking about that cash flow impact. And then also from a compliance perspective, it's not just the cash flow, it's also having that, that cliff change mentality that you talked about, that sea change, going from not really having to do local compliance to all of a sudden being in scope of a global corporate tax.
So that could be quite a change. And as you talk to people about Pillar 2, is there any particular rule, Shabana, that people reference the most as top of mind?
Yeah, so I think this depends on, the nature of the group. So whether it's a UAE headquartered group or if it's a foreign headquartered group. For the UAE headquartered groups, they are particularly concerned around the under tax payments rule and the subject to tax rule, because essentially, assuming that the UAE doesn't introduce the income inclusion rule, they will be caught by any intergroup flows coming in from foreign jurisdictions by way of the under tax payments rule or the subject to tax rule. And if it's a foreign headquartered group, then the issue is actually the opposite. They're more concerned about the income inclusion rule being applied at the parent jurisdiction level, and therefore any tax savings they may have generated by being based in the UAE are essentially going to be eroded, because now a top-up tax will just be applied at the parent level.
Got it. And so you started off actually the discussion talking about the sort of sea change in terms of the way of thinking about tax. So I'd like to end with perhaps have you do a bit of crystal ball gazing. When you think about Pillar 2, how, if at all, do you think that may change the overall tax landscape in the UAE and the Middle East, perhaps in the long term?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a question on everybody's mind. There's no formal announcements by any of the governments here yet. They have, of course, all of them with the exception of Kuwait, have endorsed the Inclusive Framework member statement in July. So they are fully expected to support the proposals. And I think, the reality is that there's a very fine balance to be struck here between wanting to be compliant with international regulations. And we saw that with the introduction of, for example, country by country reporting, economic substance regulations issued by the UAE not so long ago. So they will be very mindful of wanting to be in compliance, but also wanting to, further the growth agenda here. And we know that the UAE is very ambitious and aggressive growth ambitions. So they'll also want to seek out innovative ways to attract foreign direct investment. And so I think that there'll be some changes, and we'll see that across the region, not just the UAE. But in terms of, the specific details, I think that's something that we're very closely watching, and we hope to see some movement on post the OECD announcements in the coming few weeks or months.
Well, just very interesting, Shabana, and I guess that's right. We need to wait and see what comes out and then how quickly things get adopted. But very interesting thoughts on just how, in many ways, the minimum tax is just a different concept to the tax regimes applying today in the Middle East. So it'll be very interesting to see how things proceed in the near term. Well, yeah. Shabana, thank you very much for your time. It's been great to catch up with you today, and it's good to see you back in the office.